Hi, everyone, and welcome to Video 1 for the Psych 3311 Library Lab. This video is your lecture, and my name is Gina, and I will be walking you through the lecture materials today. So we have a number of goals for the library lab, which is 3 videos, by the way. So after you complete this one, be sure to catch videos 2 and 3 before you complete your lab report. Each video contains information you'll need to complete that lab successfully. So we will talk about how to identify 3 types of articles. In the next video, video 2, my colleague Brent will walk you through composing a keyword search to find these articles and specifically talk about searching a database called Psyc Info using advanced features. This is really good information. It will help you, of course, not only with this course, Psych 3311, but also with your future classes in psychology and beyond. And then finally, video 3 will cover how to get online research help if and when you need it. So we will start first by reviewing popular and scholarly sources. I know for your pre-assignment you viewed a brief video about this, and I thought it would be useful to take a look at some sources that were produced as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and in response to the COVID-19 pandemic to get us thinking about the differences and even similarities between these different types of sources. So over on the left here, we have some examples of popular sources. Here we have an issue of Time magazine, When the World Stopped. We have an article from NPR, which is National Public Radio, but they also produce news stories. And then down here on the bottom, we have some podcasts or radio programs. All of these can be considered popular sources. We could even consider some social media content popular sources. It's really quite the spectrum. Now, popular sources tend to be briefer or shorter than scholarly sources. Sometimes you'll get a fairly lengthy magazine article, but news articles tend to be pretty short in length. And then, of course, radio programming and podcasts can vary, but they're not going to be really in-depth or really lengthy like our scholarly sources, which we will talk about shortly. So let's talk about audience as well. So for our popular sources, the audience tends to be sort of the general public. The idea is that anyone would be able to pick up or listen to any of these popular sources and understand it. The language that's being used isn't necessarily technical or difficult or academic, whereas with scholarly sources, that is the case. Scholarly sources, also the idea is that they're informing you either about what happened or they're entertaining you, maybe providing a little bit of analysis. And then as far as when they are produced after an event happens, generally pretty quickly, right? Especially with news sources, something happens and then within minutes we expect to see, a summary of that or a recap of that on, our news feed of choice. And so they are produced really quickly. Usually there's some level of vetting, some level of editorial review, but it's not at the same sort of level that we find with our scholarly sources. And we will talk about why that is a little bit more in depth later in this lecture. Now, if we pop over to our scholarly sources on the right, I have 2 examples here. The first one here is a snapshot of a cover of a scholarly article called The Emotional Path to Action. Empathy promotes physical distancing and wearing of face masks during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then here in the foreground, we have psychological insights for understanding COVID-19 and work. And this is actually a book cover, an academic book. So these are just two of the most common types of scholarly sources. Later, we will focus on the scholarly articles, but it's worth thinking about both of these. So as far as length, let's start with scholarly articles. These tend to be, as I mentioned, longer than popular sources. I would say the average length of a scholarly article is 15 to 25 pages. Of course, that can vary, and books certainly are longer. The audience is also different. With these scholarly sources, you're going to find a lot of academic terminology. You might find graphs and data and charts, reference lists, which we'll talk about later, and it might not be accessible or easily understandable for your sort of general audience. Also, the purpose is different. And so generally with scholarly or academic sources, the author is providing you with in-depth analysis or discussion into a research question or research findings, whereas popular sources tend to be a little bit more surface level. And again, I am making generalizations here. Of course, there are always exceptions. As far as how long it takes to produce, scholarly articles and scholarly books and scholarly sources take longer than popular sources. There are a variety of reasons for that. Of course, they're longer, so it just takes more time. Sometimes, especially if you have a group of scholars conducting research, the research process itself takes a while. And then they also, especially in the case of scholarly articles, go through the peer review process, which takes some time. And again, we'll talk more about that later. Now, I want to underscore here that this isn't popular versus scholarly. Certainly popular sources are useful, and scholarly sources can be useful. It really depends on your information need, and sometimes only one or the other is available. So you just go with what you've got. The other piece here is that not every type of information source falls neatly into the scholarly or popular sort of dichotomy. There are many, including what we have here in the middle, that are somewhere in the middle. So here I have a screenshot from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, from 2019. And it's an information page about what they were calling the coronavirus disease, COVID-19. Certainly, especially at the time, this was a very reputable and very important place to get information. So just because it's not scholarly in the sense of a scholarly journal article, still absolutely useful. Okay, so what we'll do now is review the 3 articles that you looked at for your pre-assignment. So this first one here is Adolescent Social Media Use and Mental Health from Adolescent and Parent Perspectives, and that's the title. If we pop up to the gray bar, you see it says Journal of Adolescence. That is the name of the journal this article is published in. And way up at the top in blue, it says Journal of Adolescence 61. That's the volume. And it gives us the date and the page range. This one is actually only 11 pages, so it's fairly short for a scholarly article. Another thing to point out here at the very bottom, we have a link here, and within this link, it says DOI. I want to point this out because for anytime you're citing a scholarly article in a class, you will need to include the DOI, which is the Digital Object Identifier. And so just keep in mind that those can usually be found on the front page of a scholarly article as well. So as I mentioned, one of our goals for today is to talk about and explore what sort of criteria we can use to determine what type of source it is that we're looking at, whether it's scholarly or popular or something in between. So the first piece that's important to look at is authority. So who wrote the thing? So in this case, we do have our authors listed here under the title of the article. So we have Christopher T. Berry, Chloe L. Sidoti, etc. And below their name, it says Washington State University. What this signals to the reader is that these folks work here. And they typically or generally are professors or maybe even graduate students at Washington State University, meaning that they have advanced degrees. Professors typically have PhDs, right? So they are experts in their field. Students sometimes don't realize that our professors, part of their job is not just only to teach us, but also to research and publish articles or books. So it's very common for researchers to also work at universities or colleges. The second criteria is citation. So how do the authors cite their sources? Another really good clue to look at if you're determining what type of article it is you're looking at. So in this one, if we go down to the body of the text here, we see some what we call parenthetical citations or citations in parentheses. So I see Seabrook, Kern, and Rickard, which are last names, comma, 2016. And I see this throughout. If I were to scroll to the last page of this article, I would see a reference list. And as psychology students, this should look familiar. These authors are using APA citation style. So that's a big clue. This is a scholarly article. Next is purpose. Whose experiments are the authors reporting? So if you haven't already become familiar with an abstract, please do. An abstract is generally found at the top of an article or the beginning of the article, and it is essentially a summary of what the article is about. So this is a really important piece to read when you're evaluating whether or not an article is something you want to use. So if we look at this abstract, it tells us this study investigated adolescent and parent reports of adolescent social media use. The sample consisted of 226 participants and so on and so forth. So we can see here, if we read this in depth, that they are talking about their own study they did with 226 participants. So they're reporting their own research, and this is called an empirical study. They're sharing with us what they researched and what they observed or what they found. And this is a different type of scholarly article than another one we'll talk about shortly. You will be asked about this on your lab report, so keep in mind empirical means that authors are reporting their own research. And finally, the last piece here is audience. Who is this written for? Again, the language here in this article might be a little dense. It might be using psychological terms that your average person might not be familiar with. If we scroll through this article, we might find data and graphs, of course, that reference list. So we can quickly determine that these scholarly articles tend to be written for other scholars, but also you, right? Our professors ask us to read these because we are studying psychology. Students are also part of that audience. Okay, moving on to Article 2 that you looked at for your pre-assignment. This is called Online Communication, Social Media, and Adolescent Wellbeing, a Systematic Narrative Review. Again, this looks fairly familiar to the one we just saw. In gray at the top, Children and Youth Services Review is the name of the journal. And then if we pop down to the bottom, we can find that DOI or digital object identifier we need for our citation. So let's walk through those 4 criteria. First, authority, who wrote it? Just like before, we'll look at the authors here. We have Paul Best, Roger Magtalou, and Brian Taylor. And if we look below, it tells us that they work at the University of Ulster, perhaps in different departments, but they are all professors with likely PhDs at the University of Ulster. Next is citation. How do these authors cite their sources? So right away in this introduction, I'm seeing those same types of parenthetical citations. And if I scrolled to the end, I would find that lovely reference list, meaning we're using APA citation style. Here's where it gets a little different. Purpose. Whose experiments are they reporting? So again, we'll turn to that abstract or summary up here to figure that out. So it tells us here under background, much debate and polarization exists regarding the impact of online social technologies on the mental well-being of young people. Objective, to systematically review and synthesize current empirical research on this topic. So that's what they're doing here. They are reviewing and synthesizing or summarizing current empirical research, meaning they're looking at what other people have found, other empirical studies, and they're just providing us a nice summary. This type of research is called a literature review. Sometimes you just see the word review alone. And we can see up here in the top, even in that subtitle, it says it's a systematic narrative review. It's still a scholarly article. It still goes through the peer review process, but it just has a different purpose. Which gets us to the question of audience. Who is this written for? So like before, other scholars, of course, would read this. Students like yourself would read this. But the beauty of a literature review or a review is that it can be useful also for practitioners or even parents or other people who care about, the population being studied. If you are a busy doctor or a psychologist, for example, you might not have time to read 25 different empirical articles. But you could read one literature review to get a summary of what's known on a condition or a topic. Same if you're a parent and, for example, your child needs treatment. If you find a literature review or two, it can be a good way to quickly sort of get a synopsis of the current state of knowledge or research on that issue. Okay, so the third article, the FOMO is real, how social media increases depression and loneliness. Already we can see it looks different. It's a lot more pleasant to look at, right? There's color and there's a photograph of someone. We can see here, we have a nice summary at the top. New research reveals how social media platforms like Facebook can greatly affect your mental health. So we know we're looking at something different. In your pre-assignment, you were asked to think about who wrote this. And if you had followed the link to the website, you would have been able to get information about the author, who is a journalist, right? That person doesn't necessarily have a PhD or an advanced degree, but instead their expertise is in journalism and reporting. It's not better or worse. That's just how it is. It's different. And then the question of citation. So how do they cite their sources? Well, we certainly, if we look through this article, we don't see APA citation style or MLA or Chicago or anything like that. We don't see an academic citation style, but we do see what we commonly find in news articles, for example, is linking or sort of gesturing to an original source. So if we look at this bottom paragraph here, this sentence that says approximately 77% of all Americans have a social media profile of some kind, that 77% is linked. And so if we click on that, we'll be able to get to either more information or the original source or something like that. And so this is journalistic convention. To do this, they don't provide a reference list, which would sort of make people's lives easier. That's how journalists do it. They're not using a scholarly citation style. And sometimes I should mention that sources, wish to remain anonymous. And so sometimes there's no additional information, especially when you're reading, cutting edge political news. Sometimes the documentation or the individual who is a witness, for example, isn't willing to come forward. And so you do encounter that on occasion. Okay, purpose. Whose experiments are they reporting? So just like a literature review, a popular source like this, and this, by the way, is from Healthline. It's a website, sort of a consumer and news type of health resource. They're informing us. So they're reporting on other people's experiments. They're providing sort of a summary, just like a literature review, but in a more, it's shorter. It's a little more of an accessible package for readers. And then finally, who is this written for? Well, because this is a popular source, we know this is written for the general public. And if you look at Healthline's mission, that resource, their mission is to help your sort of average person understand health information. I'm not necessarily advocating for Healthline as a resource, but that's pretty typical of popular sources. Okay, so let's pause here. In summary, these are the 4 things I want you to leave thinking about to help you determine if an article you're looking at is scholarly or popular. So 1 is authority, who wrote it? 2 is citation style. How do they cite their sources, if at all? 3 is purpose. Whose experiments are they reporting? 4 is audience. Who is it written for? And of course, there are many other clues you can look for to help you determine, what it is exactly you're looking at. But these 4 are a really good place to start. And again, you'll need to be thinking about these because you will be asked about this on your lab report that you will turn in. Okay, so to wrap up today, I do want to spend just a bit of time on the peer review process. I know you viewed a quick video for your pre-assignment, but it's always good to pause and review. So there is an author, let's say there's a scholar, let's say it's your professor, and she is interested in the impact of social media on teenagers. And she has a research question. So she thoroughly researches this, maybe with a team of her colleagues, maybe with some grad students, and they write up what they find in what we call a manuscript. That manuscript is then submitted to a journal of her choice. Maybe she selected the journal because her research fits the type of thing they publish, maybe because it's prestigious, many different reasons. After she submits it, the editors of the journal, who are also scholars, will review it to make sure that her scholarship is sound. They sometimes, actually oftentimes, send this out to other scholars who study the same thing. So other academics, experts, professors who have studied social media and teens. And that takes a while. So here we have a clock represented in step 3. So after this process, after some time, the editor will contact the author and request that she make any revisions the peer reviewers have suggested. After she does that, and again, this can take some time, she will resubmit the manuscript for publication, and then it's published in a journal, which is typically accessed by students like you through a library database, which I'll talk about shortly. Now, the idea is that the peer review process ensures validity because other experts are looking at the research, therefore improving the quality of the article. The idea also is that peer review guards against bias. So if the author has a bias, that the idea is that the peer reviewers would pick up on that and ask her to maybe correct for that in the revision process. So peer review does a lot of good things. However, if we look down here at the bottom, peer review isn't perfect. So you may have heard of this. In 2010, the medical journal, which is a very prestigious journal called The Lancet, retracted a study they had published that linked vaccines to autism. And you might have heard of this. Again, a lot of people sort of latch on to this idea, and you commonly hear this sort of link spoken about in the anti-vaccination movement. But the journal later said, oops, we shouldn't have published this. Peer review process didn't pick up everything. The research is not sound, and so we retract this. In essence, we take this back. But the damage was done, right? You still hear people referring to this research even though it's no longer valid. So the idea here is just always approach anything you read with a critical mindset. Always have your critical thinking hat on, because peer review process is great. It's the best we have, but it's certainly not perfect. And then finally, I will leave you with some framing for why you need to use the library and specifically the Psych info database for the research you're going to do for your lab report that my colleague Brent will cover in video 2. But when you use Google or Yahoo or Bing or any other typical search engine to find sources like the popular source we looked at from Healthline, you can usually get that stuff for free. And that's because when you're using Google or otherwise, you are accessing information, what we call the open web. This stuff typically has lots of ads, and that's why you don't have to pay for it, because they're making money through advertising. However, the scholarly sources, the scholarly articles that we talked about today, and a bunch of other stuff, lives in what we call the deep web or behind a paywall. And so Google and Yahoo and Bing can't get that stuff for free. However, that is the library's role on any university campus, is to pay for subscriptions to this stuff for you. So you pay tuition, right? It's sort of like the gym. Use it while you've got it, because when you graduate, unless you work at a university or a particular company, you probably won't have access to this stuff. So now I will turn it over to my colleague Brent, who's going to show you how to get into the deep web, how to do keyword searching and use Psych info to find those resources. And again, remember to watch videos 2 and 3 before you complete your lab report. Thanks so much and have a great day.